I told my children they could have everything, and for the first time in weeks, they smiled at me. They thought they had finally won. They had no idea that one quiet sentence waiting inside a sealed legal envelope would change every expectation they had walked into that office with. The conference room felt colder than the November air outside, even though the thermostat hummed softly above us. I sat at the far end of the polished walnut table with my hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing the same navy dress I had worn to my husband Daniel's memorial service 3 days earlier. My wedding ring was still on my finger. I had tried to take it off that morning, but after 42 years of marriage, it felt as though removing it would erase something I was not yet ready to lose. Across from me sat my son, Ethan, perfectly pressed in an expensive charcoal suit. Beside him was his wife, Olivia, whose sympathetic smile never quite reached her eyes. My daughter Claire sat closer to the window, quietly scrolling through her phone until she noticed Benjamin Carter, our family's attorney, arranging several folders in front of him. She immediately locked her screen and leaned forward with sudden interest. The silence between us was not the silence of grief anymore. That had disappeared sometime after the funeral. This was a different kind of silence, one filled with calculations, expectations, and invisible negotiations that no one dared speak aloud. I could almost hear my late husband whispering that people always reveal themselves when they believe the finish line is only a few steps away. Benjamin adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His calm voice carried the familiar professionalism that had guided our family through business contracts, home purchases, and estate planning for more than 20 years. Before he could begin, Ethan looked directly at me. "Mom, we all know this has been difficult," he said carefully. "The sooner we settle everything, the easier it will be for everyone." Easier. It was such a gentle word for something that felt so heavy. Olivia rested her hand lightly on Ethan's arm as if encouraging compassion, but I had begun noticing that every comforting gesture seemed to appear only when lawyers or financial documents were nearby. Claire offered a small nod. Dad wouldn't have wanted unnecessary complications. I looked at each of them without anger. Only a quiet sadness settled over me. 3 days earlier, they had stood beside me in a church filled with lilies and soft music, speaking about family, loyalty, and the legacy Daniel had built through decades of sacrifice. Now the conversations had shifted remarkably fast toward deeds, investment accounts, lake property, retirement funds, and percentages. Not once that morning had anyone mentioned the fishing trips Daniel loved, the handwritten anniversary cards he never forgot, or the way he always insisted on making pancakes every Sunday because he believed breakfast should never be rushed. Those memories seemed to have become less valuable than signatures waiting on legal paper. Benjamin opened the first folder. His expression remained unreadable. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, "before we proceed, I need confirmation that you understand the documents presented today." I smiled gently and nodded. "I understand perfectly." Ethan relaxed. Olivia finally leaned back in her chair. Claire let out a breath she had apparently been holding. They believed my answer meant surrender. They believed grief had made me tired enough to let go of everything without resistance. I reached for the pen lying beside the folder, turned it slowly between my fingers, and looked at the 3 people I had loved more than my own comfort for most of my life. "You're right," I said softly. "You should have exactly what you asked for." None of them noticed the brief glance Benjamin gave me before placing one unopened envelope beside his final folder. 5 days earlier, the house still smelled faintly of fresh flowers from the memorial service. White lilies stood in crystal vases throughout the living room, their sweet fragrance mixing with the rich scent of polished oak furniture that Daniel had cared for every Saturday morning for as long as I could remember. The silence inside the house felt unfamiliar. For 42 years, there had always been the sound of his footsteps, his favorite jazz station playing softly in the kitchen, or his gentle voice asking whether I wanted another cup of coffee. Now every room answered me with nothing. I woke before sunrise because sleeping had become impossible. I walked downstairs wearing my old gray cardigan and prepared breakfast for one without thinking. 2 coffee mugs still rested beside the machine out of habit. I reached for both before quietly returning one to the cabinet. It was such a small moment, yet it reminded me that grief was not made of dramatic scenes. It lived inside ordinary routines that no longer had a place to go. I carried my coffee onto the back porch where Daniel and I had spent countless mornings watching squirrels race across the maple trees in our backyard. The November air carried a crisp chill that settled gently against my face. Our old wind chime moved with the breeze, producing the same soft melody Daniel always called the sound of home. I closed my eyes and listened until I heard tires rolling slowly across the driveway. Ethan stepped out first. He did not call ahead. Neither did Olivia. They walked toward the front door with determined expressions instead of the exhausted faces of people still mourning someone they loved. By the time I opened the door, Olivia was already holding a grocery bag and offering a warm smile. "We thought you should not be alone," she said. I thanked them sincerely because I wanted to believe that was true. We sat around the kitchen island while I poured fresh coffee into matching mugs. For a few minutes we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, holiday decorations, whether I was eating enough. It almost felt normal until Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom," he began carefully, "this house is going to be a lot for you now." I looked around the kitchen Daniel had renovated with his own hands. Every cabinet had been measured twice because he believed good work deserved patience. Every window had been placed to capture the morning sunlight. "It has been my home for a very long time," I answered. Olivia nodded sympathetically. "Exactly. That is why you should think about simplifying your life while you still can." Simplifying. Another gentle word hiding a heavier meaning. Ethan unfolded several sheets of paper from a leather folder he had carried inside without my noticing. "We have been talking," he continued. "There are retirement communities with beautiful walking paths, activities, medical staff nearby. You would not have to worry about maintaining such a large property anymore." I listened quietly without interrupting. They spoke with polished confidence, almost as though they had rehearsed every sentence together during the drive over. Claire arrived 20 minutes later carrying a bakery box filled with pastries. She hugged me tightly and kissed my cheek before joining the conversation as though she had always been part of it. "Mom, everybody just wants what is best for you," she said gently. "Dad always worried that this place would become too much someday." That sentence lingered in the air long after she finished speaking. Daniel had never once said those words to me. In fact, only 6 months before his passing, he had stood beside me on the porch and smiled as he watched the sunset across our backyard. "Promise me something," he had said quietly. "No matter what happens to me, never let anyone convince you that this house stopped being your home." At the time I laughed and told him he worried too much. Now his words returned with startling clarity. As Ethan continued explaining property taxes and maintenance costs, I noticed Olivia studying the antique grandfather clock in the dining room instead of looking at me. Claire's eyes drifted toward the framed family photographs lining the hallway. None of them realized I was no longer listening to their arguments. I was watching their expressions, their timing, their certainty. And for the first time since Daniel's funeral, I felt something stronger than grief quietly beginning to take shape inside me. I did not argue with them that morning because I had learned something during 42 years of marriage to a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts. The first person to fill every silence usually revealed more than the one who simply listened. So I smiled, refilled their coffee cups, and allowed the conversation to continue as though I believed every word they were saying. Ethan spread several pages across the kitchen island and pointed to charts showing maintenance expenses, insurance premiums, and estimated repair costs. He spoke with confidence, emphasizing how difficult it would become for someone my age to manage such a large property alone. Olivia added thoughtful comments about convenience, safety, and peace of mind, carefully choosing words that sounded compassionate rather than persuasive. Claire nodded often, agreeing with nearly every suggestion before I even had time to answer. None of them noticed that I never actually agreed with anything they proposed. I only listened. After they left that afternoon, I walked slowly through every room in the house. Daniel had always said that a home remembered the people who loved it. Standing in our library, I ran my fingers along the bookshelves he had built himself one winter after deciding that store-bought furniture lacked character. In the hallway hung photographs from family vacations to Yellowstone, Acadia National Park, and the Grand Canyon. Every smiling face reminded me of years when laughter had come naturally, before conversations quietly shifted from family traditions to financial expectations. I paused inside Daniel's workshop where his tools remained exactly where he had left them. His measuring tape still rested beside an unfinished birdhouse he had promised to complete for our youngest grandson in the spring. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight, and for a brief moment I could almost imagine hearing him humming softly while working at his bench. Instead, the room answered with silence. The next morning I drove to the grocery store for milk, bread, and fresh fruit. As I returned home, I noticed a moving company truck parked across the street. 2 employees were carrying furniture into my neighbor's house. But what caught my attention was not the truck. It was Olivia standing on my front porch speaking with a locksmith. She looked surprised when she saw my car pull into the driveway. The locksmith smiled politely and explained that he had arrived at the wrong address after receiving conflicting information. He apologized and left almost immediately. Olivia laughed lightly and claimed she had only been asking for recommendations because one of her friends needed help changing locks after buying a new house. It sounded reasonable, yet something about the timing unsettled me. Later that evening, Claire called to ask whether I had located the spare keys for the lake cabin. She seemed disappointed when I told her Daniel had always kept those keys himself. 20 minutes after ending that conversation, Ethan sent me a text asking if I had considered placing several antiques into storage because valuable items could attract unwanted attention. By the end of the week, every conversation somehow returned to property, possessions, accounts, or paperwork. Not one of them asked how I was sleeping. Not one of them asked whether I missed hearing Daniel's voice in the mornings. It was as though grief had become an inconvenience delaying administrative business. Saturday afternoon, my closest friend, Helen Brooks, stopped by carrying homemade chicken soup and warm cornbread. She had known Daniel since college and understood the kind of silence that follows great loss. We sat together on the back porch watching leaves drift across the lawn. She never mentioned money. She never asked about the estate. She simply held my hand for a while before quietly saying, "Margaret, do not let anyone rush you into making permanent decisions while your heart is still learning how to breathe again." Her words settled deeply inside me because they carried no hidden purpose. After Helen left, I found myself thinking about something Daniel had once repeated whenever difficult choices appeared. He believed that character was never revealed during celebrations. It was revealed during inheritance, disappointment, and opportunity. As darkness settled over the backyard, I finally walked into his study, opened the bottom drawer of his desk, and reached toward the small locked wooden box he had specifically told me never to open unless I truly needed to understand who was standing beside me after he was gone. I carried the small wooden box into our bedroom before opening it. The brass key had remained hidden inside Daniel's old desk organizer for years, exactly where he once told me it would be if I ever needed it. At the time I had laughed and told him he sounded like someone writing a mystery novel. He smiled without explaining himself, kissed my forehead, and simply said that preparation was never the same thing as distrust. As I turned the tiny key, I realized he had not been preparing for his own passing. He had been preparing me for what might happen afterward. Inside the box lay several neatly arranged documents, a leather notebook worn smooth from years of handling, and a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Daniel's familiar handwriting. I traced each letter with my fingertips before carefully opening it. His words were steady, just as they had always been when he wrote birthday cards, anniversary notes, or little reminders he left beside the coffee maker before business trips. He thanked me for every ordinary day we had shared together, saying those quiet mornings had always mattered more to him than any financial success. Then the tone of the letter changed. He explained that wealth had a way of revealing priorities people often managed to hide for years. He hoped our children would choose kindness over entitlement, patience over impatience, and family over possessions. If they did, the plans he had quietly arranged would never become important. But if they did not, he asked me to trust both his judgment and Benjamin Carter completely. My eyes filled with tears, not because of fear, but because even in his final written words, Daniel was trying to protect me instead of himself. Beneath the letter rested the leather notebook. It contained dates, observations, and conversations spanning almost 3 years. At first I thought it was simply one of his business journals, but the entries quickly became personal. He had written about noticing how family dinners increasingly shifted toward discussions about investments instead of memories. He mentioned occasions when Ethan seemed more interested in asking about property values than asking about our health. There were gentle comments about Claire wondering how quickly certain assets could be transferred, Someday, always presented as hypothetical questions. Daniel never accused anyone. He simply recorded facts with the same careful attention he gave every important decision throughout his career. One page caught my attention immediately. It described a conversation he had accidentally overheard after a family barbecue the previous summer. Ethan had remarked that maintaining such a valuable estate in retirement no longer made practical sense. Olivia responded that sooner or later everything would belong to the next generation anyway, so planning ahead was simply realistic. Daniel wrote that he hoped they were only speaking carelessly, but something in their confidence had unsettled him. I remembered that afternoon clearly. I had been washing dishes in the kitchen, completely unaware of what had been said outside on the patio. Reading his words now felt like seeing old photographs from an angle I had never noticed before. At the bottom of the final notebook page, Daniel had underlined one sentence twice. Never confuse silence with ignorance. Sometimes the quietest person in the room already understands everything. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair as evening sunlight filtered through our bedroom curtains. Suddenly, dozens of small moments from the past several years connected like pieces of a puzzle. Conversations that had once sounded harmless carried different meaning. Questions that seemed casual now appeared carefully timed. I realized Daniel had not spent his final years becoming suspicious. He had simply become observant. The following morning, I called Benjamin Carter and asked whether we could meet privately before the formal estate meeting. There was a brief pause on the telephone before he answered in his calm, familiar voice. "I have been expecting your call, Margaret." He did not sound surprised. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply suggested we meet at his office that afternoon. When I arrived, Benjamin greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room far smaller than the one where my children expected the estate proceedings to take place. After listening quietly while I placed Daniel's notebook, letter, and documents on the table, he nodded slowly. Then, without saying a word, he unlocked a cabinet behind his desk, removed a sealed envelope marked with Daniel's signature, and placed it gently between us before looking directly into my eyes and saying, "Your husband instructed me that this envelope could only be opened after you finished reading everything he left for you." I looked at the sealed envelope for several seconds before touching it. Daniel had always believed that important decisions deserved patience, never impulse. Benjamin remained silent across the table, giving me the same respect he had shown our family for more than 2 decades. Finally, I slid my finger beneath the seal and carefully unfolded the document inside. It was not another will. It was a signed amendment attached to the original estate plan, accompanied by a personal letter addressed to Benjamin and witnessed according to every legal requirement. Benjamin waited until I finished reading before quietly explaining the details. Several years earlier, after updating the family's estate plan, Daniel had insisted on adding one final provision that would remain confidential unless certain conditions appeared after his death. He never described it as punishment. He called it a test of character. The amendment stated that every major asset would appear to pass through the ordinary distribution process first. However, before any transfer could become permanent, the surviving spouse retained complete authority to determine whether any heir had attempted to pressure, manipulate, intimidate, or improperly influence financial decisions during the mourning period. If credible evidence supported such behavior, that heirs' inheritance would automatically be redirected according to a secondary charitable trust that Daniel had already established years earlier. I slowly lowered the papers and looked toward Benjamin. He planned all of this without telling me. Benjamin offered a small, respectful smile. He hoped the provision would never be necessary. He believed your family would choose compassion over impatience. But he also believed preparation was an act of love, not suspicion. He reached into another folder and carefully placed several documents beside the amendment. There were signed trust agreements, property schedules, and letters confirming that everything had already been reviewed by independent legal counsel long before Daniel became ill. Nothing had been created in haste. Everything had been built carefully, quietly, and completely within the law. "There is something else," Benjamin said gently. "Your husband gave me very specific instructions regarding timing." He explained that the amendment could not be mentioned before the initial estate meeting. Daniel wanted everyone to make their own choices freely, without fear of consequences. Their actions had to reflect genuine character rather than cautious behavior. I remembered the conversations from the past week. The repeated discussions about selling the house. The questions about keys, accounts, antiques, and property taxes. The carefully chosen words disguised as concern. None of those moments had been forced. They had happened naturally because everyone believed the future belonged to them already. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the office window, people hurried along the sidewalk carrying coffee cups and briefcases, living ordinary Tuesday afternoons without realizing how quickly a family could change after one empty chair appeared at the dinner table. "What would you like to do?" Benjamin finally asked. It was the first time anyone had asked me what I wanted since Daniel's memorial service. I thought about Ethan learning to ride a bicycle while Daniel jogged beside him down our quiet suburban street. I remembered Claire crying on her first day of kindergarten because she was afraid I would leave before school ended. Those memories were real. They deserved to remain real. I refused to let greed erase every good year that had come before. "I do not want revenge," I answered quietly. "Neither did Daniel," Benjamin replied. He wanted accountability. That single word settled something inside me. Accountability sounded nothing like anger. It sounded like truth finally meeting consequence. I gathered the documents neatly and placed them back inside the envelope. Then we followed Daniel's instructions exactly as he wrote them. Benjamin nodded once. "That is precisely what he expected you would say." Before leaving, he reminded me that the estate meeting would take place in 3 days. Until then, I was under no obligation to reveal anything about the amendment or the charitable trust. As I drove home beneath rows of bare maple trees, my telephone rang twice. The first call came from Claire asking whether I had located several insurance records she wanted to organize. The second came from Ethan suggesting it might be wise to begin contacting real estate agents soon because the housing market was favorable. I answered both calls politely. I thanked them for their concern. I agreed that planning ahead was important. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already made my decision. For the next 3 days, I would give them exactly what they believed they wanted, and I would not stand in the way of a single assumption they chose to make. I spent the next 3 days doing something that surprised even me. I stopped resisting conversations that had once made my heart sink. When Ethan suggested inviting a real estate agent to evaluate the house, I simply smiled and told him it sounded reasonable. Claire offered to help organize family documents, and I thanked her for being thoughtful. Olivia volunteered to create a list of valuable furniture that might need insurance updates before any future move, and I told her I appreciated her attention to detail. Every answer I gave seemed to make them more comfortable. Their shoulders relaxed. Their voices grew lighter. They believed acceptance had replaced hesitation. What they did not realize was that people often revealed far more when they believed every obstacle had disappeared. On Wednesday afternoon, Ethan arrived carrying a legal notepad instead of flowers or groceries. He walked through the living room, making small comments about repainting the walls in lighter colors because buyers usually preferred neutral spaces. A week earlier, those words would have broken my heart. Now I simply listened while quietly noticing how naturally he spoke about changes to a house that still belonged to me. Olivia wandered into the dining room and admired the antique china cabinet that Daniel had restored with his father decades ago. She asked whether I planned to keep everything or whether some pieces would eventually be divided among the family. Her tone remained pleasant, almost casual, but she lingered beside that cabinet longer than anywhere else in the house. Claire spent nearly an hour photographing old family albums, saying she wanted to preserve memories digitally. At first I believed that explanation. Then I noticed she carefully separated photographs showing expensive artwork, antique furniture, and silver collections before placing them into a different stack. It was not the family history that interested her. It was the inventory hidden inside it. That evening I sat alone on the back porch wrapped in Daniel's favorite wool blanket while watching the sun disappear behind the maple trees. My telephone buzzed with a message from Helen asking how I was holding up. I replied honestly that I still missed my husband every minute of every day, but something inside me had become unexpectedly calm. Daniel had left me more than financial security. He had left me clarity. Once uncertainty disappeared, fear quietly followed it out the door. The following morning, Benjamin called only to confirm the meeting time. His voice remained steady and professional. Before ending the conversation, he simply said, "Everything is prepared exactly as Daniel requested." There was comfort in hearing those words because I knew nothing depended on emotion anymore. Everything depended on choices people had already made for themselves. Later that afternoon, Ethan invited me to lunch at my favorite neighborhood restaurant. For a brief moment, I wondered whether he wanted to spend time with his mother. Instead, within 15 minutes, the conversation returned to practical matters. He explained how quickly paperwork could move once the estate process officially began. He mentioned that delaying decisions often created unnecessary tax complications. He even reassured me that he and Olivia would make certain I found a comfortable condominium if I chose to leave the house. I noticed he never once asked whether leaving was something I actually wanted. He had quietly transformed assumption into certainty. As we finished lunch, he reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "Dad always trusted me to take care of things," he said. I smiled softly because that statement was true. Daniel had trusted him. The question neither of us spoke aloud was whether Ethan had honored that trust. Friday morning arrived with clear blue skies and unusually warm weather for late November. I dressed carefully in the navy dress Daniel always said made me look confident. I fastened the small pearl earrings he had given me on our 30th wedding anniversary and slipped my wedding ring onto my finger after polishing it with a soft cloth. Looking into the bedroom mirror, I no longer saw the frightened widow who had returned from the funeral days earlier. I saw the woman Daniel had believed could carry out his final wishes with dignity. Before leaving the house, I paused beside his photograph in the entryway. I did not speak aloud because words no longer felt necessary. I simply rested my fingertips against the wooden frame for a moment before picking up my purse. When I arrived at Benjamin's office, Ethan, Olivia, and Claire were already waiting in the large conference room. Their expressions were relaxed, confident, almost relieved. Benjamin welcomed everyone warmly, invited us to our seats, arranged several familiar folders across the polished table, and after a brief moment of silence, opened the first document exactly as he had planned from the very beginning. Benjamin began exactly the way he always had during every important meeting I had attended with Daniel over the years. His voice was calm, measured, and free of unnecessary emotion. He reviewed the formal language of the estate, confirmed everyone's identities, and explained that the documents would be read in the order Daniel had specified. Ethan leaned back comfortably in his chair with his hands folded across his chest. Olivia rested a leather portfolio on the table and occasionally exchanged quiet glances with him. Claire held a pen over a yellow legal pad, ready to write notes, although I noticed she had not written a single word since we arrived. The atmosphere felt strangely optimistic, almost businesslike, as though everyone believed they were attending the closing meeting of a successful real estate transaction instead of the final chapter of a husband's life. Benjamin carefully read the first sections of Daniel's estate. Several charitable donations were confirmed exactly as Daniel had always intended. A scholarship for engineering students at his alma mater, annual contributions to the local children's library, funding for the Veterans Community Center where he had volunteered after retirement. Listening to those familiar plans brought a quiet smile to my face because they sounded exactly like the man I had loved. Ethan nodded politely during each announcement, though I noticed his attention returned immediately to the remaining stack of documents every time Benjamin turned another page. After nearly 20 minutes, Benjamin arrived at the section concerning family assets. The lake cabin, investment accounts, retirement funds, and the Whitmore residence were listed one by one. He explained the estimated values, ownership structures, and legal procedures required before any transfer could become effective. Ethan exchanged another satisfied glance with Olivia. Claire finally began writing notes. Benjamin then paused and looked toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore, before I continue, I need to ask whether you remain comfortable with the decisions discussed during our previous meeting." I looked directly at him and answered with complete confidence. "Yes, I would like everyone to receive exactly what they have been expecting." My words seemed to remove the final trace of uncertainty from the room. Ethan smiled for what felt like the first genuine smile I had seen since before Daniel became ill. Olivia relaxed into her chair and quietly whispered, "Thank you," almost as though the difficult part had already ended. Benjamin acknowledged my answer with a slight nod before continuing. One by one, he described the preliminary distributions exactly as everyone anticipated. The family home appeared beside Ethan's name. Several investment accounts were associated with Claire. Personal property was scheduled for division according to attached schedules. No one interrupted him. The room settled into a comfortable rhythm of expectation. Then Benjamin reached the bottom of the page, closed the folder in front of him, and remained silent. The quiet lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. He removed his reading glasses, placed them carefully on the table, and reached for the cream-colored envelope that had remained untouched beside his final folder since the meeting began. I recognized Daniel's signature immediately. Ethan frowned slightly. "Is there another document?" he asked. Benjamin looked at him with the same professional expression he had maintained throughout the entire morning. "Yes," he answered. "There is one final instruction that your father directed me to read only after the preliminary estate review had been completed." Olivia shifted slightly in her chair. Claire lowered her pen. Benjamin opened the envelope with deliberate care and unfolded the single sheet inside. Before reading, he glanced briefly toward me. I gave him a small nod. He returned his attention to the document and began reading Daniel's words exactly as they had been written years earlier. The letter explained that material wealth should always strengthen a family rather than divide it. It stated that no inheritance held any value if it was pursued without compassion for the person left behind. Then Benjamin reached the amendment attached beneath the letter. His voice slowed almost imperceptibly as he read the legal language. Every preliminary transfer described moments earlier remained conditional until one final review had been completed by the surviving spouse and the estate trustee. Any beneficiary who had attempted to pressure, manipulate, improperly influence, or exploit the surviving spouse during the defined mourning period would immediately forfeit every conditional inheritance listed in the estate. Benjamin stopped reading for a brief moment, looked back down at the page as though confirming every word, and then quietly continued with the sentence that caused every expression around the table to change. "The forfeited assets shall instead be transferred in their entirety to the Daniel Whitmore Family Legacy Trust, and this determination shall be final, binding, and not subject to further discretion by any beneficiary named within this estate." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The heating system hummed softly somewhere above the ceiling, and the faint ticking of the wall clock suddenly sounded louder than any voice in the room. Ethan was the first to break the silence. "That cannot be right," he said, forcing a nervous laugh that quickly disappeared when Benjamin calmly slid a certified copy of the amendment across the polished table. Olivia leaned forward, reading each line more quickly than the last. The confidence that had rested so comfortably on her face only moments earlier slowly gave way to uncertainty. Claire lowered her eyes to the document in front of her, turning each page carefully as though hoping another explanation might suddenly appear. Benjamin remained composed. "This amendment was executed 3 years ago," he explained. "It was witnessed, notarized, and incorporated into the estate plan under applicable law. Every procedure required for its validity was completed long before Mr. Whitmore became ill." Ethan looked toward me. "Mom, surely this is some misunderstanding." His voice sounded different now. The certainty had vanished. "We were only trying to help you." I met his eyes calmly. "Were you?" Nobody answered. Benjamin opened another folder containing dated notes, correspondence, and records that supported the review process Daniel had described. None of the papers contained dramatic accusations. Instead, they reflected a careful timeline. Requests to accelerate property discussions immediately after the funeral. Repeated recommendations that I sell my home before I had even finished sorting Daniel's personal belongings. Conversations concerning valuable collections while memorial flowers still stood in the living room. Copies of electronic messages confirming meetings about appraisals before I had expressed any desire to move. Each document by itself appeared ordinary. Together they painted a very different picture. Claire quietly covered her mouth with one hand. "I never thought," she whispered before stopping herself. Benjamin did not interrupt. He simply continued reading the language Daniel had prepared years earlier. The amendment explained that genuine compassion could never be measured by promises made after consequences appeared. It could only be recognized through choices made when no one believed they were being evaluated. Daniel had written those words himself in the accompanying letter. I could almost hear his steady voice speaking them. Olivia finally looked toward me with tears gathering in her eyes. "Margaret, I know how this must look." I answered gently. "No, Olivia. I know exactly how it looked before today. That is why I remained silent." The room became still again. I was not angry. I was not raising my voice. I felt only an unexpected sense of peace. Daniel had once told me that truth did not need to shout because it could afford to wait. Benjamin folded his hands before speaking once more. Mrs. Whitmore, under the terms of the amendment, the determination now belongs entirely to you. You may confirm that no improper influence occurred, or you may conclude that the conditions described by Mr. Whitmore have been satisfied. The legal authority rests with. I looked around the conference room one final time before answering. The faces sitting across from me were familiar, yet they seemed different now that every assumption had been stripped away. I could still see the little boy who used to run into my arms after school, and the little girl who insisted on helping her father plant tomatoes every spring. Those memories were real, and nothing that happened in this room could erase them. But neither could those memories erase the choices that had been made over the past week. I turned toward Benjamin and spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. I have carefully considered my husband's instructions, the documents before me, and everything that has taken place since his passing. I believe the conditions described in this amendment have been satisfied. The room became perfectly still. Benjamin nodded respectfully before making a short notation on the final page. He did not celebrate. He did not offer an opinion. He simply fulfilled the responsibility Daniel had entrusted to him years earlier. Ethan lowered his head into his hands. Claire quietly wiped away tears. Olivia stared at the polished surface of the conference table without saying a word. For a long moment, none of us moved. Finally, Ethan looked at me with tired eyes. "Is there any way to change your decision?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "This was never my decision alone. Your father made it years ago. He simply trusted me to recognize the truth when the time came." Benjamin then explained what would happen next. The family home, investment accounts, lake cabin, and other assets identified under the amendment would be transferred into the Daniel Whitmore Family Legacy Trust according to the legal instructions already established. The trust would provide scholarships for students pursuing engineering and skilled trades, support local libraries, assist military veterans transitioning into civilian life, and maintain several community programs that Daniel had quietly supported for many years. Listening to those plans brought unexpected comfort because they reflected exactly the kind of man he had always been. Even after his passing, his greatest investment would continue to be people rather than possessions. As the meeting concluded, I gathered my purse and slowly stood. No one tried to stop me. No one argued with Benjamin. The weight that had followed me since Daniel's funeral seemed lighter than it had in days. Outside the office, the afternoon sun reflected against the windows of nearby buildings while people hurried through their ordinary routines, unaware that my life had quietly entered a new chapter. Before I reached my car, I heard footsteps behind me. Claire approached first. She wrapped her coat tightly around herself against the cool breeze and stood beside me without speaking for several seconds. "Mom," she finally whispered, "I forgot that losing Dad also meant you lost the person you loved most." I only thought about what came after. I gently squeezed her hand. "Then remember that lesson for the rest of your life." She nodded through her tears before walking away. Ethan remained near the building entrance, watching silently, but choosing not to interrupt. When I returned home, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside the quiet house. The evening sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors exactly as it had thousands of times before. I walked into the kitchen, prepared a single cup of coffee, and carried it onto the back porch where Daniel and I had shared so many peaceful mornings together. The wind chime moved gently above me, filling the air with its familiar melody. I looked toward the maple trees glowing beneath the golden light of sunset and smiled for the first time since saying goodbye to my husband. Daniel had not left me a fortune to protect. He had left me the courage to recognize the difference between those who loved a family and those who only loved what a family owned. In the end, I truly gave everyone exactly what they had chosen for themselves, and the greatest inheritance my husband ever left behind was not measured in dollars or property. It was the reminder that integrity always outlives greed, and that a legacy built on kindness can never be taken away.